Hello everyone, I'm Sam from LCAProductions and welcome to episode 4 of Lovely Cooking. So I am back here on my own today, and today's episode is a bit different to normal. As you can see, I'm not in my chef whites, and that's because we are not actually cooking anything today, unfortunately. However, today is going to be a very interesting episode for you to watch. This is going to be chef's hints and tips, so yes, some tips and a few tricks and things. Nothing too specific, quite vague things really, but just to help you get through the kitchens and do stuff properly and safely. So we're going to split this episode into two parts. Firstly, I'm going to talk about balance in the kitchen and balance in your dishes, and then I'm going to do some sort of tips. So first we'll talk about balance, which is very important in the kitchen in many different ways, and I'll give you 3 ways just to show how important balance is, and then we'll get on to some various tips from me and other people. So starting off with this idea of balance, I just want to show you a few ways that balance is important in the kitchen. Firstly, let's talk about knife skills and knives. So that's something you'll hear a lot about if you watch videos on how to be good at cooking and how to be a chef and things. We're not going to go too much into the realm of being a chef and getting a job or anything like that. This is just for people who want to be a bit better in the kitchen. So in terms of knives, there are a few important things you need to keep in mind when balancing your knives. So mainly sharpness of your knives. You need to make sure your knives are decently sharp for whatever it is you're cutting. You don't want to have a knife that's too sharp, because if you go through something too fast, you might not be able to control it. Some people, you'll see videos of people with like really insanely sharp knives, and if you're just doing general cooking in the kitchen, you don't need a knife that sharp. However, in terms of balance, you also need to make sure your knife isn't too blunt, especially if you're cutting something that's really hard or solid, because otherwise you'll most likely slip off of it or get it stuck halfway through, and that could risk causing bad injuries. So yes, not only do you need to be careful about how sharp or blunt your knife is, you also need to make sure you've got the right one for the job, whether it's a filleting knife, a big knife, a small knife, a flexible knife, whatever it is. Obviously, if you're not doing too much stuff in the kitchen, if you're just cooking some basic things, you probably won't need 10 different knives, probably only need a few, but just make sure you've got the right knife for the job and that it's balanced properly in terms of how sharp it is, whatever it is you're doing. So moving on to another thing that's to do with balance, I'm going to talk about something that I'm pretty sure I've created. I don't think I've taken this from anywhere else. I like to call the 4 senses of food. So basically, this is a little thing I've came up with, all talking about how you need to keep your dish that you're making balanced and how it needs to appear to the people you're serving it. So the 4 senses of food, in order of sort of how the person that's eating it, if they're just a generic person, will take it in, is in the order of how it looks, how it smells, how it tastes, and its texture. 4 things, the 4 senses of food, as I like to call them. So depending on what dish you're doing and who you're serving it to will maybe change the order of importance of these things, but you need to make sure you've got a good balance in terms of all 4 of them, and inside each one you've got a good balance as well. So it needs to look balanced as well, so if you want to give it a decent amount of height rather than it just being completely flat, wherever you want to give it a nice bit of colour, maybe you don't want it to have much colour, maybe you just want it to be one colour, but that needs to be kept in mind, and then followed by how it smells. Sometimes that's not as important. Some people don't care about how their food smells, they just want to see it and eat it, but keep in mind that smell actually is quite important in terms of taste as well, so you're going to want to make sure that you keep the smell of your food balanced as well. Followed by how it tastes. Obviously this is very important. You want your food to taste nice, but you might want it to taste balanced as well. You might not want it too spicy, or you might not want it spicy at all. Depends on what you're cooking and who you're cooking for. If you're cooking for people that don't like spicy food, then obviously you won't want it to be spicy. And if you're cooking for people that don't like really salty food, you won't want it to be too salty. But just keep that in mind, obviously. So this is a balance between all 4 of these things, and also a balance inside each of these things. Which brings me on to my last thing, the texture of the food. So some people forget about texture and things, they just cook something, they make it up, and they don't really think about it. If you really want to impress, then you want something that covers different grounds on the texture and gives it a good balance. If you've got a dish that's really quite wet and slimy, not on purpose, that's just what it is, then maybe you want to add something that's a bit drier or crunchy to it. If you've got things that are all very crunchy, you might want to add something a bit creamy to it, etc, etc. Just want a bit of balance in there mainly with the texture. So that's the 4 senses of food, the thing I came up with there. You want to get a balance within each of them, and you also want to balance all of them. Depending on what you're cooking and who you're cooking for will depend on which one's more important, and will depend on which flavours and which senses and things you want to actually focus on putting into the dish. So now let's talk about the third part of my balance topic. I want to talk about the 5 flavours that humans can taste, and also I want to talk about the flavour triangle. Now these 2 things were mentioned in the previous episode where I made cookies with Inky Doodle Taylor and Trafford, so go and watch that. I'll just quickly run you through what these 2 things are. So in terms of balancing with flavours, these are just 2 things. There are probably more that you can use in terms of flavour. So firstly, the 5 flavours that humans can taste. This is all based around complicated science with taste buds and things, but I'm just going to quickly break this down. So basically the 5 things that you can taste, the 5 flavour groups if you want to call them that, are sweet, salty, sour, bitter and umami. So they're 5 different flavours. Obviously salty is things such as salt or bacon, sweet is sugar, maple syrup, anything like that, and sometimes fruit as well. Then sour would be lemons, acidic things like vinegar, stuff like that. Then you've got bitter as well, that would be more burnt things as they produce a lot of bitter notes. And then you've got umami, which is a harder one to explain. It's more savoury based and it's a particular type of taste. If you don't know what it is, it's hard to explain, but basically it's in mushrooms and sometimes celery and quite closely linked to bitter things as well. And it appears throughout the food group in relatively different things. So that's the 5 tastes done. The next thing I want to talk about is the flavour triangle, something else I mentioned in the previous episode. This is another way of trying to keep balance in the taste of your dish. And so if you imagine a triangle, then you want to keep balance between all 3 points, which are salty or savoury, and then sweet or sugar, well, just sweet, and then finally acid. You want to balance between all 3 of those things. So obviously salt would be salty things, as I said earlier, sweet would be sugar or anything sweet, and then acid would be things that would have acid in, such as vinegar or lemon juice. And you want to keep a balance between all 3 of them in order to keep a balance of the flavour triangle. So the flavour triangle and those 5 tastes are just 2 of the ways you can help to keep balance in taste and flavour in your dish. Again, depending on what you're cooking, you might want one thing to be more powerful than the other, but usually you want to make sure you have a bit of a balance between all of them. After all, this first chapter is all about balance. So that's the first chapter done. That chapter was all about balance and a few different ways you can see balance in the kitchen and in the food that you cook, and also a bit about tastes and how to keep balance in the flavours inside your dish. Now, if you're not too worried about serving food to other people, if you're not too worried about complicated tastes and flavours and balance inside your dish, you don't have to worry about that bit. If you're just cooking for yourself, then maybe you just want to hear a few tips, and that's what I'm going to do in this next part of the video. So I'm going to just read out a few tips that I've come up with and a few tips I've heard from other people over the years. So firstly, 3 of my tips that are a bit vague, but I'm going to explain them a little bit. First of my tips is the rule little by little. So basically, when you're cooking things, even if it is just for yourself, try not to add too much of something to it at once, especially when fixing the flavours of it, especially when taste testing. Say you think, oh, it needs a bit, I want to put a bit more salt in that, don't add a lot at once. Say you want to put some chilli in that, don't add a lot at once. Obviously, if you know that 1 chilli in a curry you're making is always enough, then go right ahead. But if you're experimenting, then do a little bit at a time. Better yet, sometimes it may be a good idea, if you can, to split whatever it is you're making into 2. If you're really unsure, that way you can alter one of them, and if it works, then you alter the other one, and you can put them back together again. So that way, if you're adding something to a dish to alter it, you don't add a lot at once and ruin it. And also, if you're really unsure about what you're doing to it, then you only risk altering and ruining a small part of it. So my second tip is sometimes something bought might be better. So most of the time, people that like to cook in the kitchen don't like to buy shop bought things. However, sometimes it can actually be very useful, and sometimes it's a bit safer or even better. So if you're making something involving pastry, if you don't have enough time to make a pastry, it's better to buy it than to rush it and for it to end up overworked or overcooked or underdone or something like that and just have it ruined. So yeah, sometimes it can just be better to buy something and use that to make something else rather than trying to make all the components yourself. Obviously, if you have the time, have the recipes and think you can do it, then go ahead, make it all by hand. But if you're running short on time, if you're nervous in the kitchen and don't have much experience, or if you think you'll be able to save money, then buy things shop bought. No one will be mad at you. So my third tip is don't go too over the top. So if you're cooking for yourself or other people, sometimes you might want to do something really crazy and out there, and sometimes it's a good idea. But again, if you're short on time, if you don't have the good enough practice and you feel like it's not going to go well, sometimes it's best to stick with the simple things. Something simple and delicious can still impress people and can still be nice for you to eat. And is it really worth risking everything and ruining a perfectly good meal just because you wanted some little fancy garnish on top of your dish? Probably not. So some other tips that aren't my own, these are from other people, and I'm just going to display these tips on the screen now. First of all, practice and experience is important. So sometimes you hear people that seem to know it all and they talk about all this complicated stuff like I've been about flavours and balance and stuff, but if they have barely even cooked anything in the kitchen before, chances are they might not even be that good. You never know, sometimes they can talk the talk and walk the walk, but it's best to make sure that if you know all this stuff, you can then put it to the test and use it in the kitchen. Secondly, if in doubt, line your tray. So this is a bit more of a specific one. Whenever you're baking something or using a tray to cook something on it, if you're in doubt whether or not it's going to stick, and if you're not too sure if the tray you're using is non-stick, it's safer just to use a bit of greaseproof paper or just to butter it or do something like that, because in the long run, even if the thing comes off perfectly easily anyway, it's safer to just put something down so that it definitely doesn't stick. Because the last thing you want is to be trying to scrape your cookies off of a tray because you thought the tray was non-stick or because you thought the cookies were going to have enough oil in them to make them not stick. Safer just to go for it and line the tray anyway. And my final tip from someone else is sometimes you can put stuff into something but you can't take it out again. So this is a bit more of a complicated one. It kind of goes back to when I was talking little by little. If you are putting something into a dish, make sure you do it little by little, especially if it's something that you can't balance out or you don't know how to balance out. Maybe you're making something and you don't want it to be too watery, but you can always add more water later in. But you might not be able to take the water back out, or you might not know what to put in to stop it from being more too liquidy. Same for things such as salt or other flavours. Don't put too much of something in case you can't take it out again. Especially if it's something that can be added later on, then you can just top it up later on, it's fine. So there you have it. There are a few tips from other people and a few tips from myself, and that is that segment of this video done. So that's the end of this video. I hope you learnt something new, and I hope you'll be able to use these skills and hints and tips in the kitchen, whether you're cooking for yourself, whether you're cooking for friends, or maybe if you're thinking of going to become some top chef, then hopefully you'll be able to use what you've learnt in this video to help you with that. And that's the end of this episode of Lovely Cooking. I hope you all enjoyed. So I'm Sam from LCAProductions, and thank you for watching. See you later. Bye.